Eastern Pacific still the only area of activity on tonight's tropical weather bulletin. And now the latest around the wide world of tropics. Tropical weather bulletin for July 9th. Well, the elusive next name in the Eastern Pacific still hasn't arrived yet, and we've still got those two high chances of development there in the basin to the south of Mexico, both at 90%. Unclassified right now as those systems are moving out to sea, so there's no real threat to land. And the Atlantic then looks like this on day 39 of hurricane season, fairly quiet as a matter of fact, with a few small areas of thunderstorm activity and a wave out in the central Atlantic. But nothing that we've marked as any chance of developing into a tropical cyclone in the next 7 days. In the Eastern Pacific then, we've got these two 90% chances on day 57 of hurricane season, both of them expected to become tropical cyclones, the first one extremely broad, likely to become a tropical storm very briefly in the next 24 hours, the other one behind it should have a better chance of getting a bit stronger. Western Pacific also quiet at this time, with a few tropical disturbances there across the basin and a few storms over the Philippines and over the Malay Peninsula. The Bay of Bengal looks like this, nothing active there either, but a little bit of monsoonal showers going on along the eastern coastlines there, and one or two little bits over India at the moment. In the Arabian Sea, all is quiet there as well right now. So let's take a look at satellite imagery from the last 24 hours, and we can take a look at which areas have been the most active. Look out for the red zones, which show areas that have had very high rain rates, a few spots in the Micronesian region of the Pacific, and along the Eastern Pacific there you can clearly see that big potential tropical cyclone. On the proper satellite imagery, looking as we would see visible mixed with the infrared there, you can clearly see the rotation from that leading system, which is enormous as you look at it there, massive bands extending hundreds of miles towards the south, but its rotation is centering much further north to the south of Baja California Sur by now, which means that it is running out of time to get itself going. But I still think it will reach tropical storm status briefly before weakening again as it moves over colder waters. Also a slight rotation starting in the far eastern Pacific as well to the southwest of El Salvador, and we're looking across the Atlantic here now as well, and you can see that other little wave that's looking actually quite interesting on this satellite image, but it's surrounded by a sea of dryness, so it's really going to be temporary. And moving back over towards the eastern Pacific on the water vapor imagery, you can just about see the extreme lengths of this potential cyclone, and to its east its time will come, that second system, but first this big first one's got to get itself out of the way. Sea surface temperatures look like this today, still very warm along the coast of Mexico, but I imagine this very broad system might do a little bit of a number on those temperatures, but still 30 degrees plus in a large area. The Atlantic Gulf of Mexico is scorching hot, as well as anywhere around the coast of Florida really, through the Bahamas and around Cuba, pushing 32 degrees Celsius in multiple places now. Out over the Sargasso Sea looking very good as well, and the Gulf Stream really piping hot there, extending as far as South Carolina, temperatures 30 degrees Celsius or more. Western Pacific also looks very good, with very warm sea surface temperatures around the Philippines and out to sea near those mid-latitudes almost, 30 degrees plus there, and through the Japanese islands, the southern Ryukyu Islands looking good there as well, around Taiwan over 30 degrees, and in the Gulf of Tonkin. Bay of Bengal also looking at 30 degrees Celsius along the coast of India. The Arabian Sea fairly cool in general, but extremely warm in those inland sea areas near the Arabian Peninsula. Southwest Indian Ocean temperatures have receded quite a lot here, down to 25, 24 in a few spots where you expect to see a bit higher. Australian region also, of course, this is the winter months now down there, and in the South Pacific temperatures starting to fade even along the southern islands of Fiji and Tonga below 26. Here's the anomalies compared to average. Orange is above average, blue is below. It's still well below in a large part of the eastern Pacific out to sea, which will hinder storms later on in their life. But the eastern Pacific, the eastern Pacific, very warm, slightly warm above average, but the El Nino effect in the equatorial region clearly showing itself. The Atlantic, Gulf of Mexico, around 2 to 3 degrees above average, but it's the eastern Atlantic that's still showing itself to be well above average. Western Pacific also slightly above. Oceanic heat content is still increasing for parts of the Caribbean and entering the Gulf of Mexico, still extremely good amounts there. Eastern Pacific looks like this as well, and you'll note there off the coast of Mexico there's still a decent area there of good OHC, but it has waned a little bit across the basin. Western Pacific still looking extremely good and increasing around Luzon. Computer models then, this is the GFS for the next 5 days. What it's expecting is a surprise in the Atlantic. No other models have picked up on this yet, but the GFS is suggesting that we might get a potential subtropical or maybe tropical cyclone that forms out over the open waters of the North Atlantic there towards the end of that 5-day period. ECMWF I think has a low pressure system that's not tropical. GFS looks like it might be taking it all the way, so that's a development we'll have to watch closely in the next few days. Eastern Pacific, there's that first cyclone, very large of course as we know, holds on as a tropical storm for maybe a couple of days at most and then really fades out quite quickly. The next one behind it takes a much more southerly track and that will give it a better opportunity to intensify a little bit, but even that one is struggling there on that latest GFS run, which is the expectations have been tempered since yesterday's update on that one, and now we're expecting a weaker storm, at least in that 5-day period. Over 7 days, rainfall amounts will look like this, and we're not expecting as much now. I don't know whether that's because some of it has already fallen, but ahead of us, we are expecting in the next 7 days, a few of those areas inland over Mexico to get at least 6 inches of rainfall. That's 150 millimeters in a few spots. But in general, rainfall will be quite limited and localized, and along the coast, rainfall amount shouldn't get much above 2 inches. That's 500 millimeters. And you see 1 or 2 spots there approaching 8 inches still. That's 200 millimeters. Out to sea, in some of the hot spots near these tropical cyclones, maybe 12 inches, 300 millimeters. But along the coast there, really not expecting huge amounts, as these 2 storms are expecting to move quite far away from land areas. Well then, into the longer range, we're still looking out at the Atlantic system here, and the GFS, if it hadn't become a tropical cyclone by this point, it decidedly does later on in its forecast, and you can see it moving off towards the east there to the Azores, through the Azores as a strong tropical storm, and then veering off towards the northeast, starting to turn post-tropical towards the end of that 10-day period there, looking very interesting. That would be a bit of a turn up for the books this early in the season. You wouldn't normally expect to see something like that. Eastern Pacific, this second system obviously, does it have a second go at it? Well, it's trying there, and maybe it does get a little bit stronger the second time around, but it eventually moves northwestwards too far over the cold waters and it will lose itself quite quickly. A small system there, GFS indicating probably a peak intensity of maybe 60 to 65 miles per hour, judging by those colours. Thankfully though, staying far away from land. That's all the serious stuff done with. That means I get to talk about the merch store, scan the barcode, and that will take you straight there to our store page, where you can get pillows and hoodies and all kinds of other interesting items, and are still waiting for Hone t-shirt, which, will it ever go out of fashion? Well, that's the big question which the Central Pacific remains to answer. In the silly range, and this is quite silly, you might be forgiven thinking it's still tropical by that point, but it's not a tropical landfall over Ireland and then through the UK and onto Europe. That will be post-tropical by that point by about 2 days at least, but certainly an interesting system that continues to move on, quite a well-organised one, and that would be a big surprise for this time of year. You'd usually expect to see something like that much later on, September, October time. But I'm reminded of storms like 2014 Bertha, which did it quite early on in that season as well, although it had been long since not tropical by that point. Western Pacific, two systems, little and large. Look at this. A big typhoon in the South China Sea and a small one which gets extremely powerful near the coast of the Philippines in the latter days of July. What an extraordinary forecast from the GFS there. Huge typhoon in the South China Sea, getting to at least Category 1, maybe Category 2 before landfall in Vietnam. And then that second one which gets to at least Category 4, possibly Category 5, as it passes close to Catanduanes and then on to Luzon. But that is very long range. Do not take that very seriously at all. It is silly range for a reason. You can talk about all of that on our Discord server, discord.gg/force13 for tropical weather chat and general weather chat around the world. On this day, it was July 9th, 1996, when we had Hurricane Bertha, which was peaking, another Bertha, on this day as a Category 3, and a very fascinating storm that one was as well, very photogenic briefly at its peak intensity. I couldn't quite find an image of its peak with the small time that I had, but there's an image of it just a little bit later on that day, where it was just passing north of the Dominican Republic. We also had Typhoon Dan in the Western Pacific, moving northwards towards Japan. Bertha, of course, would go on to strike the east coast of the United States, and if it wasn't for Fran, probably would be better remembered that year. In the Atlantic, the next name this year is Don. In the Eastern Pacific, it's Calvin. Where is it? It should have been here by now, most people probably would say. And in the Central Pacific, of course, it still is Hone next up. In the Western Pacific, Talim, North Indian Ocean, Tej is the next name in those two basins. We're still stuck at 27 storms so far for 2023, but I'm pretty sure that number will start to pick up soon. The Australian region, next up is Jasper. Southwest Indian Ocean starts with Alvaro this season, and in the South Pacific the next name is Lola. That's all from tonight's Tropical Weather Bulletin. We'll be back again tomorrow night.